My name is Rishi. This is Aishwarya. Right? And today we will be going over one of your CNS questions for the finals, namely the cerebellum, right? Its structure, subdivisions, its functions, and then we'll be covering the nuclei and its afferent connections, right?
Okay, so before we move on to structure or anything, let's first figure out the position of the cerebellum. It's located inferiorly to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Anterior to it, we have the pons and the midbrain. And inferiorly, we have the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. There's also the space in between the pons and the cerebellum, which is called the fourth ventricle. This will be discussed in another video by some of our other peers. This section over here that you see is a sagittal section, which divides the cerebellum into two hemispheres. Um, and we can see the difference in color between, which shows the two layers of the cerebellum essentially. The outer layer, which is a little bit darker, is the cerebellar cortex, and it's composed of gray matter. The inner layer is what we call the arbor vitae, mainly because it resembles the branches of a tree, and arbor means tree and vitae is life. So we also call the cerebellum the tree of life. This part is composed of white matter, and it's where all of your cerebellar nuclei and all are present. We also have to talk about three important structures, which are called the cerebellar peduncles. These are just structures that help connect the cerebellum and its fibers to various other parts of the brainstem. So superiorly, we have the superior cerebellar peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain over here. The middle cerebellar peduncle connects it to the pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects it to the medulla. Okay, so to begin with the structure of the cerebellum, we can divide it into three lobes as well as zones. So the lobes we have are an anterior lobe, which you can see in yellow over here. We have a large posterior lobe, and we have a small, tiny flocculonodular lobe, which is seen in blue over here. These folds that you see in between, they're also called as folia, and we have two bigger folds that separate each lobe, the primary fissure separating the anterior and posterior lobes, and we have the posterolateral fissure, which separates the flocculonodular and the posterior lobe. We can also divide the cerebellum into three zones, essentially. This central one over here, narrow region, is called the vermis. The vermis is important because it helps in maintaining balance, and it receives all the input from your axis of the body. So it receives input from your shoulder, neck, thorax, and abdominal muscles, which are the muscles which are important for maintaining balance. So you can see the correlation over there. The zone next to it is called the intermediate zone. This receives input from your limbs, and which is why it's important for any skilled movements that you would need to make. Then we have a large lateral zone on the sides, and this is important for regulating motor activity. We'll talk more about the functions of these zones in the next slide here. We can also divide it into its functional divisions. So we have the cerebrocerebellum, like I mentioned, which is consisting of the lateral zones of the posterior lobe mainly. Like I mentioned before, it's important for regulating your muscle activity and planning your movements as well as motor learning. As the name suggests, it receives inputs from your cortex as well as your pontine nuclei, and it sends inputs to your thalamus, which is this part is what is important for planning of movements. Then we have the intermediate zones, which also make up the spinocerebellum. Like the name suggests, again, it receives inputs from your spinal cord, and it's also important for receiving proprioceptive information. So proprioception is essentially the body's ability to sense its position in the surrounding space. So it's what tells our body the position of other objects in relation to ourselves, and it's what allows us to make movements and take steps without any conscious thought running through it. So like we discussed, the intermediate zones receive inputs from your limbs. And those are the most important, I would say, parts that receive and are important for proprioception. Then we have the vestibulocerebellum, and that's your flocculonodular lobe on the bottom. And as the name suggests, again, we know what the vestibular apparatus is, we know what it does. It's important for your balance and your ocular reflexes, that is, any eye movements that you need to make, any head movements, etc. Okay, so now let's talk about the two layers of the cerebellum. So the outermost layer is called the cerebellar cortex, and it's composed of gray matter. It has three layers in itself. We have the molecular, which is the outermost layer. It's what you would see from when you look at the cerebellum first. Then we have the Purkinje cell layer and the granular layer. So the molecular layer has two main cells, the stellate and the basket cells. And it also has these fibers known as parallel fibers. You'll be learning more about these fibers and cells and what exactly they do in the next video about the cerebellum, which is about its intrinsic and afferent connections. The Purkinje layer is, again, it only consists of Purkinje cell. And then we have the granular layer, which has your Golgi cells, this yellow one here, and your granule cells over here. I wanted to talk about two types of fibers that reach the cortex. We have mossy fibers, which are these blue ones, light blue ones over here. Those are basically any afferent fibers that are going towards the cerebellum. So they synapse with the Golgi and granular cells. We also have climbing fibers, and these are fibers that specifically come only from your inferior olives. And they synapse with your cerebellar nuclei that I will be talking about in the next slide, as well as your Purkinje cells. Yeah, so now let's go to the next layer, the Arbor Vitae, which is your white matter layer. And this is where you have your four cerebellar nuclei. So we have the dentate, which is the largest one and is the most lateral one. So this would correspond to your lateral zones. We have the emboliform and the globus. So these correspond to your intermediate zones. And then we have the vestigial in the middle, which corresponds to your vermis. So keeping in mind the functions of those zones that we mentioned, we can remember the functions of these nuclei as well and what fibers they receive. So the dentate, which is in the lateral zone, received input from your cortex. So it receives corticopontocerebellar fibers. And therefore, it's important for regulation of motor activity and timing. The emboliform and the globus, they can also be called interposed nuclei because their functions mostly correlate with each other, and their function corresponds with the intermediate zones. So the emboliform sends fibers to the thalamus, while the globus receives inputs from your vermis and sends it to the medulla. Lastly, we have the vestigial nucleus, which function corresponds with the vermis in the middle. So like we mentioned before, it receives inputs from your spinal cord as well as your main axis of the body. So it receives spinocerebellar fibers, and it also projects to the spinal cord as well as another thalamic nuclei called the ventral thalamic nucleus. You'll learn more about your thalamic nuclei in another video. An easy acronym that helped me to remember all of these, especially in the order in which they're located. We have don't eat greasy foods, starting from the lateralmost to going medial. So don't dentate, emboliform for eat, greasy for globus, and foods for vestigial. And yeah, now Rishi will talk about the afferent connections of the cerebellum.
Okay. Starting off, right, with the afferent connections, you have around 7 to 8 tracts running to and from your cerebellum, right? But what does afferent mean? Afferent means it's coming from somewhere into your cerebellum. So it's receiving information, be it sensory, proprioception, or even any motor plan that your cerebrum comes up with. It has to be run through your cerebellum. So even those would be considered as afferent fibers. Now, there are more than three, the three that I listed out here, which I will show you in the next slide. But these three are known as the spinocerebellar tracts, right? Why spinocerebellar? Because it comes from the spinal cord into your cerebellum, right? You have three, namely your dorsal, ventral, and cuniocerebellar tracts, right? Your dorsal spinocerebellar tract picks up information, sensory information, proprioception, touch, pressure from C8 to L2 or L3 spinal nerves. And your ventral one from L2 and below, or up until coccygeal, and cuniocerebellar is C8 and above, right? So it's pretty self-explanatory. Now, looking at how each of these tracts work, I know it's a complicated image or there's a lot of stuff going on, but we can go through it one by one slowly, right? Now, let's start off with here. So let's say I have, these are my sensory fibers, right? They can be the ones in your skin and throughout your limbs anywhere from CH to L2, right? We'll start off with the dorsal spinocerebellar. Now, once this information is received by your nerves, they are carried to the dorsal root ganglion. Your dorsal root ganglion in your spinal cord is the first order neuron that will be receiving these impulses or information, right? It will then propagate it all the way to your posterior gray horn. And from there, it will synapse at one of the nuclei in your posterior gray horn, namely the Clark's nucleus. Now, if you remember, the Clark's nucleus is only present from CH to L2 or L3, right? It is not present in anywhere else. And for the other tracts that have synapses in your lateral gray horn, they are just called lateral horn nuclei, right? Clark's nuclei are very specific to only C8 and to L2. Now, after synapses at these nuclei, the second order neuron will then carry this information all the way up from the lateral white matter into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncles, right? There's no synapse happening in the medulla or pons or midbrain. It goes directly and enters the cerebellum and transfers its information there for the processing. So the first order neuron would be your dorsal root ganglion. Second order would be Clark's nucleus. And then the third order would be the final synapse in the cerebellum through your inferior cerebellar peduncles, right? And why is it called the dorsal cerebellar tract is because these fibers, if you know the spinal cord section, you have your anterior part and the posterior part, or the ventral and the dorsal. And you notice that these fibers are running via a dorsal route, via the dorsal part of the spinal cord, and then they ascend up. And that is exactly why it is named dorsal spinocerebellar tract, right? Now, coming to the ventral spinocerebellar tract, which I've drawn here in red, if you can see, it'll be picking up information from L2 spinal nerves and below, all the way until coccygeal spinal nerves. Same thing, proprioception, sensory information, touch, pressure, sometimes even temperature, right? And it carries all this information and then again into the dorsal root ganglion, right? Now here, there is no particular synapse, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I was explaining cuniocerebellar, but we can continue with cuniocerebellar. Now, your cuniocerebellar would be picking up information from C8 and above, right? Anything that is basically above your neck, right? So your neck and even from your upper limb. It'll pick up proprioception, pick up information, sensory information, carry it to the dorsal root ganglion, enter to the posterior gray horn of your spinal cord, and then directly ascend upwards ipsilaterally, just like your dorsal spinocerebellar tract. It's ascending up ipsilaterally. It's not crossing over to the other side. It's staying on the same side and synapsing on the same side, right? So same thing with your cuniocerebellar tract. It'll come here and then ascend up directly. There's no synapse happening here. And then there's a nucleus here in your medulla called the accessory cuneate nucleus. accessory, you must have heard about the cuneate nuclei, right? When you're going over the DCML pathway, the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, right? You have your cuneate and your gracilis nucleus from the left and right sides, and they sort of just have a crossover here, where like they go contralaterally and then they ascend upwards, right? And those things are called your internal arcuate fibers. Similarly, you have an accessory cuneate nucleus in the medulla, where these fibers from the cuneo-cerebellar tract come and synapse. Then the cuneate nucleus accessory fibers carry them all the way to your cerebellum, again from the via the inferior cerebellar peduncles. And these are called your external arcuate fibers. Internal arcuate fibers for the DCML pathway and external arcuate fiber for the cuneo-cerebellar pathway. Now, going back to what I misread before, your ventral spinocerebellar tract, right? Again, same thing. Ventral spinocerebellar is from L2, L3, and below, all the way till coccygeal. Proprioception, sensory information, all of that picked up by the neurons, nerves, and then carried to the dorsal root ganglion, which then propagates it again through the lateral gray horn and synapses at a posterior gray nucleus, right? This nucleus, the second order neuron, and then that crosses over to the other side of the anterior part of the spinal cord, right? Remember how we mentioned that the dorsal tract was running on the dorsal or posterior part of the spinal cord. This one crosses over to the anterior side and then ascends upwards. That's why it's called the anterior or ventral spinocerebellar tract. So as it as it goes upwards, right, after crossing contralaterally, it goes all the way up and it enters your cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncles. Now, it does an interesting thing after it passes through the superior cerebellar peduncles because the nerves don't really synapse here. The third order neurons do not, like, they don't synapse here. They'll come here, cross over from behind the cerebellum and synapse to the other side, right? So it's a double contralateral inversion, hence making it ipsilateral because the nerves will, like the sensory information picked up from, well, this is my left side and it is synapsing again in the left side, right? So contralateral here and then again contralateral there makes it ipsilateral. And that was your ventral spinocerebellar tract. Now, all of these three together known as spinocerebellar tract, you have a tiny accessory tract called the inferior olivary tract or the spino-olivary tract, right? You know how your cerebellum has olives? They're like literally shaped like an olive, right? You have, again, information for sensory information for motors and motor plans or any other thing, any for motor timing or anything for even motor learning, right? You have information coming here, and then it enters via your posterior gray horn again, synapses with a nucleus in the posterior gray horn, but probably the name is Rex lamina 7 if you have learned about the sections of the gray horn. And from there, it then second order neuron crosses to the contralateral side and then ascends upward via the anterior part of their spinal cord, and then synapses at something called the inferior olivary nucleus, right? The inferior olivary nucleus and then again crosses over to carry it to your cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and then it synapses in the cerebellum, right? An important thing to note, as Aishwarya mentioned mossy and climbing fibers before, any fibers coming from the inferior olivary nucleus into the cerebellum are always termed climbing fibers, any afferent connections. Whereas any other information coming from any of the other 7-8 tracts that are coming from other regions except the inferior olivary nucleus are called your mossy fibers. So the one coming from your DST, your VST, and your cuneo-cerebellar tract, they're all termed as mossy fibers, as you can see I've written over here, right? And so this was your spinocerebellar tract. I'll be going over some accessory tracts as well, right? Because it's very important to know. But those were the main ones, right? Now, since you know that there are the cerebellar peduncles that carry the information from the spinal cord into your cerebellum, right? Your superior cerebellar peduncles only had that one ventral spinocerebellar tract, whereas your inferior have two more and your middle has just one more, right? So coming to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, you have your vestibulocerebellar tract. Vestibular, when you hear the word, you just immediately think of what auditory signals, right? Because of your vestibular nucleus in your medulla. That's exactly what it does. It originates at the vestibular ganglion, right? Specifically from the semicircular canals in your ear. It picks up sensory information about balance, about position, about your overall sense of direction, and climbs up, and then it terminates at the floccular nodular lobe as well as in the vestigial nucleus, because it has to, if it's going to the vestigial nucleus, that's probably about your axial body, right? Axial body, and important for balance, and your flocculus and your nodulus as well. Now, the next one would be your trigeminocerebellar tract. Your trigeminal nerve, what sensory information do you think it would have? It would have sensory information about your face, right? You have your V1, V2, and V3, specifically dividing the sensory information. So it originates from the trigeminal ganglia, or the nuclei in the brainstem, right? And then it terminates in the cerebellum ipsilaterally as mossy fibers, because again, mossy fibers are any afferent fibers that do not come from the inferior olivary nucleus. And what does it carry? Like I said, it carries sensory information from the head and face, right? Now, and last but not least, from your middle, via your middle cerebellar peduncles, right, you have something called your pontocerebellar tract. From your pons, you have certain nuclei called the pontine nuclei, right? When a motor plan has finally been thought up by your prefrontal cortex, by your cerebrum, right, and it wants to carry out this action, right? Let's say you lost your balance and you have to take a step back to, stabilize yourself. Of course, it's a reflex, but that plan that your motor part of your cerebrum comes up with runs across the cerebellum as well, just as a run through, so that there's nothing wrong with it, and it happens very quick. So you have your pontine nuclei in the pons, right? So when you have your descending tract from the spinothalamic tract, or the descending motor pathways, right? Some of the fibers from there, they synapse at the pontine nuclei, and then the pontine fibers carry them into the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncles. And that's basically what it is, right? It originates from the pontine nuclei and terminates as mossy fibers into the cerebellum. And what does it carry? It carries information about the motor plan. And like I said, technically it is a part of your corticospinal tract or your descending motor pathways, because according to the cerebrum, it's an efferent path, but for your cerebellum, it will be an afferent path because it is coming into the cerebellum as well, right? So it's just a technicality for you to remember, but yeah, these are the main 7 tracts, right? Of course, there are other minor tracts, but I doubt you'll have to be, well versed with it. So yeah, that was it, guys. I hope you guys understood everything Aishwarya and I were saying. And all the best for your exams. If you guys have any questions, you can let either of us or Nikhil or anyone else know, and I'm sure they will either come to us or give you the answer directly, right? So I hope you guys enjoyed, and yeah, take care, guys. All the best. Bye bye.